So in this video, we're going to be arguing that perception is the source of knowledge. The main reason to be concerned about this debate is that you need perception for modern science. If perception is not the source of knowledge, either knowledge itself is impossible, or we're born with all the knowledge we need. In either case, we don't need to go out and perceive the world to figure out scientific principles or make new technology based on it. But first, let's see what different philosophies have to say on the matter. Empiricism is the belief that knowledge starts with perception, and that we can trust perception since it makes us aware of the world automatically, according to immutable laws of the universe, with no power of choice to distort or make up. Famous empiricists include Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, and John Locke. Scepticism is the belief that perception is unreliable, and that you can have no certain knowledge. Skeptics include Thomas Hobbes, David Hume, and their philosophical descendants such as the positivists. Finally, rationalism is the belief that perception is unreliable, and that knowledge comes through innate ideas that we're born with. The most famous rationalist is René Descartes. It is highly influential today, like in the idea that different groups of people inherit different kinds of knowledge and therefore different values and goals that they act for, or in Noam Chomsky's belief that humans have an innate system of grammar. Now, if rationalism is wrong, this doesn't mean that there aren't similarities between the grammars of different languages, just that you need a better explanation for these similarities. You need a wider context of knowledge to come up with this better explanation. And this is the focus of philosophy rather than the specific sciences. So there are many arguments the rationalists and the skeptics use to try to show that perception is unreliable. For example, they often argue that you could be dreaming right now, and all the things you believe that you are seeing and hearing are all part of this dream. Sometimes they also argue that you could be hallucinating right now, and no experience of yours is actually real. But obviously it's actually possible to know when an experience is a dream and when it's real. If it were not, then we wouldn't have separate words for dreaming and perceiving. It's true that people sometimes mistakenly think that they're perceiving something when they're dreaming it, but this doesn't show that perception is unreliable, just that sometimes people mistake other experiences for perception. Another argument that is often used is that when you dip a stick into water, it looks like it bends when it really doesn't. Or sometimes they will show you an optical illusion like Kanizsa's triangle, and say that because it seems like there's a white triangle here, your perception is flawed. However, these arguments ignore the fact that perception works automatically and deterministically, so any apparent mistake can only come from choosing to make some inference. There isn't any mistake in seeing light refracting differently from the part of the stick submerged in water. The only mistake is in inferring that the stick will still look bent when it's refracted through the same medium. There isn't any mistake that comes from simply looking at Kanizsa's triangle. The only mistake comes from choosing to say, there are contours making up a triangle here. So, as I was saying, perception functions automatically, and as such it can't really be right or wrong. Sometimes it's argued that the Ishihara test shows that perception can be right or wrong, as some people can't distinguish a 74 in it, which shows that either colourblind people are wrong not to see a 74, or the ordinary sighted are wrong to see a 74. However, neither group is wrong. In both cases, they are perceiving the same reality. Although from a practical perspective, it is more helpful to be ordinarily sighted and to be able to visually distinguish the 74, from a philosophical perspective, perceiving less information doesn't mean you can't trust what you do perceive. You can still be certain of the fact that you're looking at a plate of several dots. It just means that perception has limits, just like everything else in the world, and it's still valid as far as it goes. So that's some of the arguments that the rationalists use. Now we're going to go back to the empiricists, who often make an argument that undermines their position. Empiricists often argue for a theory called representationalism. This is the view that you don't actually perceive the world around you, just the effects that the world has on your mind. Under this view, an apple isn't red in reality, it's just the effect that it has on your mind. The world causes an image in our heads, and that image is perceived by a little man. But clearly this leads to an infinite regress. Surely this little man will need his own little man to perceive, and so on and so forth. Now, representationalism tries to explain causation in perception, but the mistake here is assuming that it's some kind of sequence of separate, discrete events, like in a game of snooker. But causation can also be two things constituting one system that results in an action. For example, a car crash isn't caused by a car alone or the hazard alone, but both the car and the hazard as constituents of one system. Likewise, perception is not caused by the perceiver alone, but by the perceiver and the environment as one system. So perception is caused, which does mean that it is in some way influenced by your particular physiology. Skeptics have used this to argue that this means perception is subjective, and it gives you no reliable knowledge of the outside world. They would argue that you can't be sure whether apples are red, because this is just the way that you personally perceive them. Take Thomas Hobbes, for example. Whatsoever accidents or qualities our senses make us think there be in the world, they be not there, but are seeming and apparitions only. The things that are really in the world without us are those motions by which these seemings are caused. And this is the great deception of sense, which is also to be by sense corrected. For as sense telleth me, when I see directly that colour seemeth to be in the object, so also sense telleth me, that when I see by reflection, that colour is in the object. Now, how exactly your deceptive senses can correct their own deception is a contradiction that Hobbes never really answers. So instead, let's make a steel man. The content of your perception depends on you, and external objects don't depend on you. Therefore, the content of your perception is not external objects. To answer the skeptics here, we need to distinguish the form and object of perception. The object of perception is what you perceive, and the form is how you perceive it. For example, if the object of perception is a bed, then the form would be a soft touch, a cuboid shape, red if that's the colour of the sheets, and so on and so forth. Now, the object of perception is its content, and it doesn't depend on you. The content of perception would continue to exist even if you didn't. The form of perception, however, does depend on your existence. If we put this corrected premise into the argument, we get the conclusion the form of your perception is not an external object. But this was never in dispute, and this gives no reason to be sceptical of the content of our perception. The form doesn't contradict the object. The form doesn't distort or make the object subjective. Again, perception is what it is, and this includes the form and the object. It is given automatically, rather than being dependent on choice, which would open something to being evaluated as right or wrong. Now, the form-object distinction isn't some ad hoc answer to the skeptics, but is part of a larger distinction between what we know and how we know, which also disproves the innate ideas of the rationalists. What we know are particular objects in the world around us, as provided to us in perception. This doesn't mean our knowledge is limited to perception. We're capable of abstracting and forming concepts and ideas. Concepts aren't particular things, but are integrations of particulars. They're a process of particulars, and so concepts are squarely how we know. Now, we've already shown that perception is inerrant and automatic, but the problem with innate concepts is that the concepts are how we process particulars in reality, and particulars are only given to us in perception. This means that you cannot have concepts without perception, as processes must process something. So that's the basic rundown on whether perception is valid, and the empiricists' arguments on it. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more Randian content.